and thanks for joining me this evening for this very special Out of Time Bibliotherapy live session. I feel that this time of year is a particularly wonderful and unique time when it seems that you're cut away from your usual constraints and concerns and worries. And it's a time that you can, in a way, abnegate your responsibilities, curl up somewhere with a good book. Ideally, if you have a lovely reading nook, that's the place to go and forget about real life. It seems a great opportunity to neither be worrying about the year that's just been nor worrying about the year that's ahead, but simply cozying up with a fantastic book or three and escaping into that. So I wanted to do a special live bibliotherapy session this evening all about the books that take you out of time. I'm going to be looking at various different ways that they do this, and I am going to start with books that are written about this exact time of year, because a lot of authors have found this time of year a really inspiring time to write about. Christmas, we have just had, there's so many excellent books set on Christmas Day or in the time leading up to Christmas. But there's also a lot of fabulous literature set in this period between Christmas and the New Year, the 12 days that lead up to the new year. It's lovely to see lots of you joining tonight. Hi, Ollie. Great to see you. Hi, Alessio from Brazil. Lovely to have you here as well. And hello to my Instagram followers as well. Hi, Ro. Great to see you. So I'm going to be talking first about the books which are actually set in this period between Christmas and New Year, the 12 nights, which could be described as the Epiphany. And one of the ones that I want to mention first is actually called 12 Nights, which is by Urs Fayes, who is a German author. And this novel has only just come out, it's just been published. It's translated from the German by Jamie Lee Searle, and it is very beautifully translated. I can very much recommend this as a great read for exactly now. It's a book which is all about literally the days that are leading up to the new year, when Manfred, a man who is of indeterminate age, but probably at least in his 50s, is returning to his childhood village on a very snowy mountain in the middle of nowhere. And he has come back to try and make up with his brother, who he's had a decade long feud with. And he's clearly got a lot of terrible things in his past that he's got to confront. There's a dead horse involved. We don't know what happened, but it was clearly something terrible. There's also a woman who both brothers clearly loved, and she is no longer with them. So we realize that there's a lot of tragedy lurking in the background of this snowy story. And it's written in quite a dreamlike way. It's written all in the voice of Manfred as he experiences the dreamlike state when he becomes ill and he's lying in a pub, semi hallucinating and wondering whether he's ever going to see his brother again, whether his brother will come and talk to him. And he's having lots of dreams and memories of his childhood. So I'll just read you a little bit from this very beautiful and beautifully translated book to give you a sense of the poetry of the language. This is Manfred, who's waiting for his brother, and he waiting for his brother to perhaps come and forgive him. And he's tossing and turning, lying half asleep and wondering whether his brother will ever come. His mother's petite form darted through the room with the pan, its dried berries and grasses glinting festively. This had been a custom in her family in the upper Wrench Valley, and one she had never let herself be dissuaded from, not even by his father's mockery. As she worked, she would tell them stories about the ghost of an old monk with a pointed beard and buckled shoes who wandered the valley's forested massif, and of the water spirits in the Mummelsee which rose out of the depth when startled by a stone. Manfred had often followed his mother around in awe of the solemnity and devotion of her rituals. She wouldn't be swayed by anyone, not even the pastor, for whom this was a step too far. The burning of herbal concoctions to fumigate the house, again and again up to Epiphany, and the garden too, where she kindled fire even amidst deep snow. She began gathering the plants in summer, by the stream, in the meadows, in the forest, labelling and drying them: juniper, St. John's wort, oregano, and toadflax. There was a carefulness to this, a love of all creatures that he greatly admired. Ancestry, this was the word that came to mind, maintaining a connection with one's forefathers, the grandparents and parents, preserving a part of their lives, and in doing so, a part of oneself. That's what I love about this book. It has a tremendous sense of the longevity of time, the connection of time between now and the past, the customs of the past and the customs of the present. And it is a book that does have hope and a new beginning at the end without giving it away too much. And I think it's a great one to read in this lovely, unique period between one year and the next. Hi, Colleen, it's great to have you joining me again tonight. And hi, Helen, you're right, there is a cat in the book nook. I don't know if people can see it. She does love to go to sleep there. That's Lulu the cat. And if ever I'm not in that book nook, she is. And if I go and sit there, she'll try and sit on me as well. But fair enough. Where's a cat to go? So, other books that are set in this lovely period between Christmas and New Year, I wonder if you know of any. If you do, do tell me. But one of the ones that I've recently loved and discovered is a book called Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk by Kathleen Rooney. Hi, Sasha. Great to see you here. You made it. Fantastic. So, Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk is a book that was only just written in 2017 by Kathleen Rooney, and it's all set on the New Year's Eve of 1984, so going into 1985. And it's a really unusual, excellent, quite meandering book, but I love it partly for its timing, the fact that it's set on New Year's Eve itself, but also because it's such a love song to New York City. It's all about an 84-year-old woman who actually is probably 86, but she lies to all her friends and tells them that she's a couple of years younger, who is based on a real woman who was the highest paid advertising executive of the 1960s to 70s. And Lillian Boxfish is her fictional counterpart, who is a very feisty, cool, and sassy woman who decides on New Year's Eve to go for a walk. She wants to go to her favourite restaurant. She wants to go and visit some old haunts where she used to go when she was young. And she decides in the end to go to a young friend's New Year's Eve party. And that's what she does. It's a love letter to city life. She absolutely adores Manhattan and New York. And she spends the whole of her evening ruminating about her life and what happened during her years from when she was in her 20s up to now. She fell in love. She had an amazing career. She wrote some of the most snappy and brilliant advertising language of her era. She encountered sexism and snapped it down as much as she could. So we hear all about her very brilliant and feminist history, and we also see what she's seeing at the time. So she traverses a gritty Manhattan, grittier than the Manhattan that she grew up in originally. And she encounters bartenders, chauffeurs, security guards, bohemians, criminals, children, parents, and parents to be. She actually assists at somebody's birth, which is really fantastic. We are clearly um, going through as much as anyone can possibly go through in one New Year's Eve, but you believe it as you read it. It's probably only about 200 pages, this book, Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk. It's a really lovely read, and it does meander because it goes back and forth in time from the present, 1984, to the various aspects of her life, like when she first met her husband, when she eventually divorced her husband, when she gave birth herself, and all the many ups and downs of a woman's life. And what I love about her is she has such a great spirit. She's indefatigable. She does get nearly attacked by muggers and she manages to fend them off, even though she's 84. Everyone mistakes her for being much younger because she holds herself so well. Let's all remember that, girls. We should keep our poise and stature at all times. And she manages to do down the terrible ruffians, and she actually swaps her mink coat for the coat of one of the guys that is trying to mug her and get some money off her. So I just love her. She's such a great character. It's a really lovely read, and it's all set on New Year's Eve. So it is the perfect book for right now. Ollie, you're saying that you miss Manhattan. I agree. Wouldn't it be great to just go there now and spend New Year there? But you can do it through the means of a novel. One of the things that Lillian Boxfish is famous for in this book is her eternal politeness and civility. She says, "For though I was raised Protestant, my true religion is actually civility. Please note that I do not call my faith politeness. That's part of it, yes, but I say civility because I believe that good manners are essential to the preservation of humanity, one's own and others, but only to the extent that that civility is honest and reasonable, not merely the mindless handmaiden of propriety." So Lillian Boxfish, she's an old-fashioned girl. She believes in civility, and that's in a way what gets her through her life now that she's single and old. But she really is full of optimism and joie de vivre. So I would fully recommend that book. Other books that are set in the period between Christmas and New Year, or in this period at the still point of the turning of the year, I can't help but mention again Moominland Midwinter by Toby Janssen. And sorry to regular people that come to these sessions, I know I talk about the Moomins too much, but this one is a gorgeous book set in the period when everyone is hibernating and only Moomin Troll gets up and experiences the winter when everyone else is asleep. There he is, loving seeing the snow come down, which he's never seen before because he's always been asleep when the winter has come. So I won't rave on about the Moomins again because you all know that I love them. But anyone that hasn't yet encountered the Moomins, now is the time to seize the whole Moomin box set, I say. Um, Other fantastic books set in this period would include Agatha Christie's The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding, which is one of the first Agatha Christie short stories that she ever wrote. It's actually a rather brilliant, very short story involving a stolen ruby, which turns up in a Christmas pudding. And that's not actually giving away the plot. I would thoroughly recommend that as a great read, great one to read aloud. And that all takes place in a big country house during Christmas where Hercule Poirot is theoretically there to experience a traditional English Christmas, which is what he then does. But then, of course, there's also a murder mystery involved. Also, another excellent Christmas and post Christmas story, which I didn't mention in my last session, which was all about Christmas stories, is Christmas Pudding by Nancy Mitford, the wonderful and redoubtable Nancy Mitford, who wrote The Pursuit of Love. Christmas Pudding was written in 1932, and that is a hilarious, wonderful, utterly Christmassy, very witty, very caustic story, which is pure escapism. It's not the best of the Nancy Mitford's novels, but it is a really great one to read. And I've just got a little quote about her writing it, which is rather lovely. Her sister, Jessica Mitford, recalled that during the writing of Christmas Pudding, a comedy of errors set in the Shires over the course of a few days in December, Nancy spent months giggling helplessly by the drawing room fire, her curiously triangular green eyes flashing with amusement, while her thin pen flew along the lines of a child's exercise book. Yet, just months before, she had tried, albeit half heartedly, to kill herself. She switched on the gas fire in her room without lighting it. Her convoluted pseudo engagement to Hamish Erskine, a gay Scottish aristocrat, had finally hit the buffers, and she was all misery. Erskine had his faults, but he was also, in Nancy's eyes, a scream. Now she had no one to tell the funny things that happened to me, she quotes. Completing Christmas Pudding, which was a book eagerly awaited by her publisher, felt like an impossible task. How to write a comic novel when you're suddenly prone to crying on buses, she asked herself. But she did manage to complete it. It was published in 1932, and she was only 28. And it's still a really fantastic read. It does possibly seem a tiny bit dated in some ways, but you just can't go wrong with Nancy Mitford. She's such a great writer, always funny, always upbeat, and always hilarious, full of misunderstandings and acute observations of society life. It's a really excellent read. So those are some of the Christmas stories, or in between Christmas and New Year, that I know. Helen has very kindly mentioned The Snowball by Bridget Brophy, which is not one that I know. Thanks for mentioning that. I'm going to look that up, Helen. That sounds really intriguing. And I'm sure there are many more fantastic reads set at this time. If anyone else knows any and wants to share them, please do tell me on Facebook or on Instagram, or tweet me. But I now want to talk about not just books written at this period, but also books that take us to that sense of being outside time, which I hope you agree is what we are feeling at this time as a common rule. I think this period between Christmas and New Year is a kind of blessed and magical moment when we are able to hide from reality. We're not yet facing our obligations of the coming year. If you're in the academic world or if you're at school, you can still be hiding from your future term and prospects. A lot of people are still on holiday and not going back to work till early January. So it is a unique and excellent time, which feels very special, and a time to be cocooning yourself in your own company or in the company of the people that you live with, and a time to be reading lots of books. Um, David, thanks for mentioning A Traveller in Time by Alison Utley. In Between Time, one of Estelle's favourites, he says. And thanks, David, for backing me up with the Moomins. I'm glad that you and Estelle are loving the Moomins. So that's A Traveller in Time, which I don't know. And actually, there's a lot of excellent time traveling books, which, thanks for reminding me, I was going to mention, which in a way are a slightly different category to what I'm talking about now, because time travel is not quite the same as what I was thinking about this period of stillness in between the 2 years. But it is relevant because people that can time travel obviously live outside time in some ways. So, A Time Traveller's Wife, for instance, by Audrey Neffenegger, that's a book which explores what it's like to live outside the normal constraints of time. And it does it absolutely brilliantly. There's also an excellent crime novel, which I'm sure some of you will know, by Lauren Bukes, called The Shining Girls, which is quite a dark and sinister novel, a very clever twist on the serial killer trope, in which the serial killer can travel in time. And it's very interesting to think about notions of crime being outside time anyway. But to tell you a bit about the Lauren Bukes, if you don't know it, um, there's a man called Harper who's on the run in 1931. He comes across an abandoned house, which, when he breaks into, appears to be mysteriously well kept up, even though it's abandoned. There's something about the house that shows him girls who will shine, the shining girls, and who he then, for mysterious reasons, has to kill. Um, One of these girls that Harper is attempting to murder is called Kirby, and she's attacked in 1989. There are a series of grisly murders. It is quite a dark book for people who are not for the faint, not it's not for the faint of heart, basically. It's quite grim in some parts, but it is a racy and compelling read. Uh, it actually flits back and forth in time quite a lot. It goes forward to 1993, it goes back to 1931, and then it goes back and forth with all the girls, these shining girls. And we have many different kinds of characters: an architect, a biologist, a transsexual, a dancer, and so on. And we very much get to know all these doomed girls. But it is quite grim, very interesting, quite disturbing. And the reason I was mentioning it tonight is because it does take us outside of time, because the serial killer himself can travel back and forth in time. So it's an interesting one. And I wanted to move on to the idea of crime being and living outside time, which is a notion which many authors over the ages have investigated. For instance, Dostoyevsky in Crime and Punishment, which he wrote in 1866, goes into immense depth of the trials and tribulations of Raskolnikov, the main character, who decides to kill an unscrupulous pawnbroker old lady in order to then live off her money. So Raskolnikov is one of the most philosophical and deep thinking characters in the whole of literature. If you haven't read Crime and Punishment yet, you must. It is a truly profound and brilliant book, but not an easy read because it is dealing with very dark subject matter. But Raskolnikov is a character who's experiencing terrible poverty, and he believes that if he kills this pawnbroker, who is a woman that in his view deserves to die, because she herself is a very unscrupulous woman, then he can liberate himself from poverty and go on to perform great deeds. So he is, in a way, an idealist, but a very confused one. Of course, once he does commit the crime, he's racked with confusion and disgust at what he's done. His justifications for his deed completely disintegrate, and he struggles with paranoia, guilt, and horror as he realizes exactly what he's done. Here is a fantastic quote from his voice. We're always thinking of eternity as an idea that cannot be understood, something immense. But why must it be? What if instead of all this you suddenly find just a little room there, something like a village bathhouse, grimy and spiders in every corner, and that's all eternity is? Sometimes, I can't help feeling that's what it is. That's a terrible thought, and that is something that I'm going to come to a little bit later with this book, Some, which is a book that does actually explore notions of eternity in a very similar way to Dostoyevsky and Crime and Punishment. Another brilliant author who investigates crime, the morality of crime, and the way that committing a crime takes you out of ordinary time is Albert Camus in his famous novel, The Outsider. Here it is. This is a book which delves into the mind of someone who refuses to compromise in the way that he behaves. It's a classic existentialist novel exploring the alienation of an individual, refusing to conform to social norms. For instance, when his mother dies, he refuses to show any emotion. He says, "My mother died today, or maybe yesterday. I don't know." He doesn't seem to care. But in his view, he is acting with complete honesty. Albert Camus portrays a man confronting the absurd and revolting against the injustice of society. He depicts the paradox of man's joy in life when faced with the tender indifference of the world. So it is a book that does have a lot of joy in it, despite being about a murder and an ultimate existentialist view. It is an amazing book to read, and it actually would be a great book to read in this period too, because there is something so timeless about it, and it does take you into a world outside time philosophically rather than literally, like some of the books that we've been talking about. He says, Maman used to say that you can always find something to be happy about. In my prison, when the sky turned red and a new day slipped into my cell, I found out that she was right. I would always begin by assuming the worst. My appeal was denied. Well, so I'm going to die. In fact, nothing could be clearer. Whether it was now or in 20 years from now, I would still be the one dying. At that point, what would disturb my train of thought was the terrifying leap I would feel my heart take at the idea of having 20 more years of life ahead of me. But I simply had to stifle it by imagining what I'd be thinking in 20 years, when it would all come down to the same thing anyway. It might sound like it's all very depressing, but I'll give you a little bit more that's more uplifting. I woke up with the stars in my face. Sounds of the countryside were drifting in. Smells of night, earth, and salt were cooling my temples. The wondrous peace of that sleeping summer flowed through me like a tide. Then, in the dark hour before dawn, sirens blasted. They were announcing departures for a world that now and forever meant nothing for me. I felt as if I understood why at the end of her life my mother had taken a fiancé, why she had played at the beginning again. Even there, in that home where lives were fading out, evening was a kind of wistful respite. So close to death, Maman must have felt free then and ready to live it all again. And I felt ready to live it all again too. as if that blind rage had washed me clean, rid me of hope. For the first time in that night, alive with signs and stars, I opened myself to the gentle indifference of the world. So, this gentle indifference of the world, as portrayed by Albert Camus, is a philosophical state which is also explored by Iris Murdoch, who is an amazing and very philosophical writer, famous for The Sea, The Black Prince, The Green Knight, and many more brilliant novels. Just going to have a sip of my in between year drink. Thanks for bearing with me there. So, Iris Murdoch, she is an amazing writer who very much explored this idea of the criminal mind being one where people are not constrained by ordinary morality and ordinary contextual time. Here's a great quote that explains that better than I can. This is from The Black Prince. The division of one day from the next must be one of the most profound peculiarities of life on this planet. It is, on the whole, a merciful arrangement. We are not condemned to sustained flights of being, but are constantly refreshed by little holidays from ourselves. So that's a lovely thought, the idea that from one day to the next, we're taking a little holiday from ourselves. And that's something which Iris Murdoch explores very frequently. She says, we are intermittent creatures, always falling to little ends and rising to little new beginnings. Our soon tired consciousness is meted out in chapters, and that the world will look quite different tomorrow is, for both our comfort and discomfort, usually true. How marvellously, too, night matches sleep, sweet image of it, so neatly apportioned to our need. Angels must wonder at these beings who fall so regularly of awareness into a phantasm invested dark. How our frail identities survive these chasms, no philosopher has even been able to explain. Iris Murdoch talks a lot about false innocence and how false innocence must be lost or gone beyond in order to be recuperated as understanding or wisdom. For instance, she says in The Italian Girl, sin is a sort of unconsciousness, a not knowing. In The Black Prince, wickedness is often the product of a semi-deliberate inattention, a sort of swooning relationship to time. We ignore what we are doing until it's too late to alter it. So that idea of a swooning relationship to time as being the state where you can commit a crime and possibly get away with it is a really interesting thought. The thought that by slightly ignoring time and believing that time doesn't exist for a moment, that might be the moment when you commit a crime and then suffer the consequences afterwards when you come back to the reality of time. And that's that place which I find really interesting, that place where you step outside time for just a moment. There is another type of book which explores this as well, which is the kind of book a bit like the story of It's a Wonderful Life, which we were talking about last night, where somebody dies and comes back to life, or they take a step out of life for a moment for some reason, and then they get a new perspective on their life. And one of these books is a great novel, which was the first published novel by Peter Carey, later on famous for writing The True History of the Kelly Gang and many other excellent books. His novel Bliss is a kind of take on the story It's a Wonderful World, in which Harry Joy, the hero, suffers a heart attack right at the beginning of the novel. And before this heart attack, he was a fun-loving, happy kind of guy, happily married, liked by everyone around him, with a slightly strange family, but he loves his family and has no concerns about them. But after he has the heart attack and is dead for 7 minutes, I think, he comes back to life and he realizes that his wife is actually having an affair with his best friend. His daughter is constantly paying off her brother's deliveries of marijuana with oral sex, so incest is going on, and various other terrible things are going on around him, of which he had no inkling. And Harry basically thinks that he's come back to hell. He believes that he's been given a strange continued afterlife after having his heart attack. And that's a really interesting take on this whole idea of taking time out within your life and then coming back and having a different experience of life. Another way that that can happen in books, which many of you will be thinking, I'm sure, is time taken out with drugs. There are a million excellent and fabulous novels about the experience of taking drugs and how that takes you out of time. But one of my favorites is Vert by Jeff Noon, which is a pretty crazy experience. It's literary science fiction. Vert won the 1994 Arthur C. Clarke Award for this book. It's a cyberpunk novel which is rollicking, dark, and humorous, and it explores the idea of a future in which reality and virtual reality are blurred in a highly tenuous way, as tenuous as the brush of a feather. Vert is actually a feather. It's a drug, a dimension, a dream state. It comes in many colours: legal blues for lullaby dreams, blacks filled with tenderness and pain, just beyond the law, pink porno verts, doorways to bliss, silver feathers for techies who know how to remix colours and open new dimensions, and yellows, which are the feathers from which there is no escape. So the beautiful young Desdemona is trapped in a curious yellow feather, and her brother Scribble wants to get her out. He'll risk everything to rescue her from her state of mind. So it's a really crazy book, which is quite a mad experience, but one which I would very much recommend as an excellent read, taking you out of time like no other book. I also must mention, while on this subject, William Burroughs' City of the Red Knight. I wonder if any of you have read this book. It's a book that Heathcote Williams described as Burroughs' nightmares render Brave New World in 1984 as innocuous as the Archers. So Brave New World is quite strong stuff, I would say, as is 1984. So this is an extreme version of those. Well, it's not a version of those, it's a very different kind of book. But it's a book that my husband Carl very succinctly described as buggery, drug addiction, and rusty tins all in one book. And he said that it's a book that gave him his first completely transcendental experience, taking him literally out of time. So he was reading that book. He found it incredibly intense and demanding, because it's not by any means an easy book to read. As with all William Burroughs, it's not a logical narrative that takes place from step to step. It's one which you have to work quite hard to understand, and your brain has to perform a lot of leaps to get into the understanding of it. And Carl said that he finally allowed his brain to do the flip that took him into understanding what was going on in that book. And that's when he was literally taken out of time by that book. So I wonder if any of you have had that kind of experience with a book. And if so, Tell me about it. I'd love to hear. It may be a very different kind of book. It might be one that's nothing to do with drugs. It might be one which is maybe historical fiction, because that, of course, is another way of taking you out of time. But I'd love to know if you've ever had that sense of your brain being completely flipped over by a book to the extent that you lost the sense of where you were in real life. If so, let me know. Science fiction is, of course, another great way of books taking you out of time. And there's a couple of science fiction short stories that I would love to tell you about, which, in a way, very almost literally do take you out of time. One of them is a short story by Ian McEwan, who I'm sure most of you won't associate with science fiction concepts, because he's much more of a writer about real life situations. But this story, Solid Geometry, is a really fantastic, brilliant idea, which you have to read. I did think about reading you the whole thing tonight, but it is just a little bit too long. And there is a story in this book that I'm going to read you at the end, which is very, very short. But I will just read you the beginning and the end. So it does contain spoilers. I do apologize to people that want to go off and read the story. If you don't want to hear it, then you could switch off in a minute. But I'm just going to read you the beginning and the end. There's quite a lot of complexity in the middle, which is why it's just slightly too long to read. But I think this will give you a great flavour and also explain to you why I think it's such a brilliant story about the notion of time and space. So this is the very beginning of Ian McEwan's short story, Solid Geometry. In Melton Mowbray in 1875, at an auction of articles of curiosity and worth, my great-grandfather, in the company of M, his friend, bid for the penis of Captain Nichols, who died in Horsemonger Jail in 1873. It was bottled in a glass 12 inches long, and noted my great-grandfather in his diary that night, in a beautiful state of preservation. Also for auction was the unnamed portion of the late Lady Barrymore. It went to Sam Israels for 50 guineas. My great-grandfather was keen on the idea of having the two items as a pair, and M dissuaded him. This illustrates perfectly their friendship. My great-grandfather, the excitable theorist; M, the man of action who knew when to bid at auctions. My great-grandfather lived for 69 years. For 45 of them, at the end of every day, he sat down before going to bed and wrote his thoughts in a diary. These diaries are on my table now, 45 volumes bound in calf leather, and to the left sits Captain Nichols in the glass jar. My great-grandfather lived on the income derived from the patent of an invention of his father, a handy fastener used by corset makers right up until the outbreak of the First World War. My great-grandfather liked gossip, numbers, and theories. He also liked tobacco, good port, jugged hare, and very occasionally opium. He liked to think of himself as a mathematician, though he never had a job and never published a book. Nor did he ever travel or get his name in the Times, even when he died. In 1869, he married Alice, only daughter of the Reverend Toby Shadwell, co-author of a not highly regarded book on English wildflowers. I believe my great-grandfather to have been a very fine diarist, and when I have finished editing the diaries and they are published, I am certain he will receive the recognition due to him. When my work is over, I will take a long holiday, travel somewhere cold and clean and treeless, Iceland or the Russian steppes. I used to think that at the end of it all I would try, if it was possible, to divorce my wife Maisie. But now there is no need at all. So the hero of this story, in whose voice it's written, is quite an unpleasant man, as becomes clear as you read the story. And I'm now going to read to you what happens at the end of the story. So it's a story called Solid Geometry, and To give you a little bit of what happens in the middle, the hero is reading the diaries of his grandfather. He realizes that his grandfather's best friend M disappeared at one point, and it's never explained why. And he also realizes that there's a major section of the diary which describes geometry in great detail. So, towards the end of the story, our hero starts investigating the geometry in the diaries, and he discovers that when he folds up a piece of paper following the instructions in this diary, the piece of paper actually completely disappears into nowhere. Does it still exist in time and space? We do not know. So we also know that the husband and wife in this story, despite living with each other, really don't get on very well. They kind of hate each other. I'm just going to read you the last page of the story. Later, we sat in the kitchen eating the meal Maisie had cooked and getting mildly drunk on a bottle of wine. We smoked a joint, the first one we'd had together in a very long time. Maisie told me how she was going to get a job with the Forestry Commission planting trees in Scotland next summer. And I told Maisie about the conversation Em and my great-grandfather had about a posteriori and about my grandfather's theory that there could not be more than the prime number 17 positions for making love. We both laughed, and Maisie squeezed my hand, and lovemaking hung in the air between us in the warm fog of the kitchen. Then we put our coats on and went for a walk. It was almost a full moon. We walked along the main road which runs outside our house, and then turned down a narrow street of tightly packed houses with immaculate and minute front gardens. We did not talk much, but our arms were linked, and Maisie told me how very stoned and happy she was. We came to a small park which was locked, and we stood outside the gates, looking up at the moon through the almost leafless branches. When we came home, Maisie took a leisurely hot bath while I browsed in my study. I'm going to cut a bit because I know I'm going to run out of time. Maisie is saying how beautiful the day was, what a lovely day she's had, fantasizing about what they might do when it's summer. And then here we are, he's giving her a bit of a massage. When I had her legs in place, Maisie said, "Position number 18," and we both laughed softly. "Let's go there tomorrow to the river," said Maisie, as I carefully eased her head towards her arms. "Careful, careful, that hurts," she suddenly shouted and tried to struggle. But it was too late now. Her head and legs were in place in the hoop of her arms, and I was beginning to push them through past each other. "What's happening?" cried Maisie. Now the positioning of her limbs expressed the breathtaking beauty, the nobility of the human form, and, as in the paper flower, there was a fascinating power in its symmetry. I felt the trance coming on again and the numbness settling over the back of my head. As I drew her arms and legs through, Maisie appeared to turn in on herself, like a sock. "Oh, God," she sighed. "What's happening?" And her voice sounded very far away. Then she was gone. And not gone. Her voice was quite tiny. "What's happening?" And all that remained was the echo of her question above the deep blue sheets. So, sorry to do a slightly rushed job on that story. It's a story of about 20 pages. I'd very much recommend reading the whole thing. It's really good. And if you read the whole thing, you might get more of a glimpse of what Ian McEwan is doing there. But I love the way he literally takes a character out of time and space in a very strange and unusual way. It's highly memorable. So, another author who explores notions of time and space in this way, more time than space, is David Eagleman, who is one of my favourite authors for writing short stories. And I do recommend this book very frequently to bibliotherapy clients because it's such a great book to read aloud with a friend or partner. Each story is only about 3 to 4 pages long. Each one is very thought-provoking and funny, and they're all about ideas of the afterlife. But as much as they are about ideas of the afterlife, they're also about ideas of life, about time, about space, about death, about mortality, about what makes life worth living. And I'm going to read you one of his stories, which is literally only a page long, so it will be less than 5 minutes. And for me, it's one of my favourites, but it is a great one that makes you think about our own experience of time. It's the title story. It's called Sum, S-U-M. Ollie, thanks for backing me up there. Sum is absolutely mesmerising, she says. It is. It's one of the best. So here we go. In the afterlife, you relive all your experiences, but this time with the events reshuffled into a new order. All the moments that share a quality are grouped together. You spend 2 months driving the street in front of your house, 7 months having sex. You sleep for 30 years without opening your eyes. For 5 months straight, you flip through magazines while sitting on a toilet. You take all your pain at once, all 27 intense hours of it. Bones break, cars crash, skin is cut, babies are born. Once you make it through, it's agony free for the rest of your afterlife. But that doesn't mean it's always pleasant. You spend 6 days clipping your nails, 15 months looking for lost items, 18 months waiting in line, 2 years of boredom, staring out of bus windows, sitting in an airport terminal, 1 year reading books. Your eyes hurt and you itch because you can't take a shower until it's your time to take your marathon 200-day shower. 2 weeks wondering what happens when you die. 1 minute realizing your body is falling. 77 hours of confusion. 1 hour realizing you've forgotten someone's name. 3 weeks realizing you are wrong. 2 days lying. 6 weeks waiting for a green light. 7 hours vomiting. 14 minutes experiencing pure joy. 3 months doing laundry. 15 hours writing your signature. 2 days tying shoelaces. 67 days of heartbreak. 5 weeks driving lost. 3 days calculating restaurant tips. 51 days deciding what to wear. 9 days pretending you know what is being talked about. 2 weeks counting money. 18 days staring into the refrigerator. 34 days longing. 6 months watching commercials. 4 weeks sitting in thought, wondering if there is something better you could be doing with your time. 3 years swallowing food. 5 days working buttons and zippers. 4 minutes wondering what your life would be like if you reshuffled the order of events. In this part of the afterlife, you imagine something analogous to your earthly life, and the thought is blissful. A life where episodes are split into tiny, swallowable pieces, where moments do not endure, where one experiences the joy of jumping from one event to the next, like a child hopping from spot to spot on the burning sand. So that's a rather lovely story, reminding us that time as we know it is a better way to experience life than putting it into compartments. And I think that's a great moment to end this session, even though there are lots of other books that I really wanted to mention. Uh, I will just say Frozen in Time by Ali Sparks, one of my favourite ever kids' books, which is all about two kids in the 21st century that find their cousins who've been frozen in time in their garden from the 1950s. They bring them back up into the world and they then have hilarious adventures with their 1950s cousins. But it also becomes a bit of an adventure because they actually have to find the dad of the frozen in time children. That's a fantastic one, which also plays with notions of time. Then there's also so many other wonderful ones which people mentioned to me on Twitter and on Instagram earlier, such as A Year of Marvellous Ways by Sarah Winman. Thanks for that, Jan. That was a great suggestion, which is a very timeless novel, which also takes you out of time. The Children of Green Know, which is another children's book which takes place during a snowy season. So that's another lovely one to read right now. And so many more fantastic novels, fictions, poetry, and short stories. But if you've got any others that you'd like to mention to me, please do email me, ella@ellabertu.com, or send me a message on Facebook or on Instagram. And I'll be coming back next week, next Wednesday, the first Wednesday of the new year, to do another bibliotherapy session live. Do send me suggestions because I don't know what the subjects will be yet. And I'll also be doing a session on Damien Barr's Literary Salon Facebook page on the 13th of January, which will be all about new beginnings in literature, which I'm very much looking forward to. So thanks so much for joining me here this evening. Happy New Year to all of you. I'm sure next year, 2021, is going to be a far better year. And in the meantime, let's all read lots of fantastic books together.